start with Mr. Cram for 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Professor Deitch from the University of Victoria, I read with interest your book entitled, or that you co-authored, entitled, "Do Central Banks Serve the People?" I suppose now might be a good time for a spoiler alert for anyone watching at home, but Professor, do central banks serve the people?
Yes, they do, but we can always do better. So this is a very good question to reframe what I said earlier. So central banks' main mandate today in most countries is a narrow mandate of price stability, and for a long time, I would say for most of the post-war period, that was a good mandate because what central banks did to promote price stability did not have too many unintended side effects on other policy objectives. Now, with the financial crisis and with the COVID crisis and with the new instruments that central banks have been employing, there have been more unintended side effects of these policies on other policy fields, including on wealth inequality and on the climate. And so that's why we're in a position where I think we have to rethink how the interaction between what central banks do and what other parts of government do interacts. So what I've tried to show earlier is that something that happens under the supervision of the Bank of Canada, namely bank lending, actually throws a wrench in the green transition. And I think that's something that we need to A, realize, and 2, act upon.
Professor, in your book, you talk about a lack of transparency at central banks and the lack of response to criticism that central banks take. Can you elaborate on these points a little bit?
So, I mean, it's tricky because what central banks they do today is watched by by financial markets, and every word is put on the scale. And so the official communication of central banks is relatively restricted. They have become more transparent, but one of the aspects that we criticize in the book is that there is no open political debate about the substantive issues about what central banks do and what the unintended side effects are. So if you look again at the concrete point that I made earlier, the fact that the Bank of Canada in our case implicitly accepts all the lending by commercial banks in Canada is not something that is widely discussed as a political issue.
If the Bank of Canada were to adopt this taxonomy system, and after some time there are problems with the system that need to be corrected, how do we avoid some of the problems that you identified in your book with the lack of response to criticisms and the lack of willingness of central banks to correct their past mistakes?
I think there's good models in the past and in the present for how to do these things. So, for instance, in Asian countries, there's much more coordination between governments and central banks. In the past, in countries such as Canada or in European countries, there was much more coordination between what the government does and what the central bank does. So today we've got a very strong independence framework, and there are justifications for that. So we have to be careful in tinkering with the system that we have, but at the same time, the unintended side effects, in this case on the climate, are becoming too important to ignore them.
In this
Parliament... Sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is my microphone on now? Okay, yes. Very good. So there has been an idea debated in this Parliament that central banks and the Bank of Canada should be subject to audits by the Auditor General's office. In your opinion, Professor, would this offer a greater degree of transparency for the Bank of Canada if it moves forward with this taxonomy system?
Look, the devil's in the detail. There are many ways to implement this coordination that I talked about. I'm not going to endorse one over the other at this point. What I'm arguing is that we need this coordination so that the right hand of the government doesn't undermine what the left hand does. Right now, we've got a commitment to climate goals, and what I've tried to show is that central bank action, or what happens under the supervision of central bank action, actually throws a wrench in the green transition. So that's what needs to be addressed. There's many ways to do it.
Okay, thank you. Chair, how am I doing for time? A minute left. Okay, so maybe I'll switch gears to Mr. Arnold from the Canadian Climate Institute. Mr. Arnold, what would happen to the rates of return of pension funds and mutual funds if chartered banks focused less on rates of return and more on complying with the taxonomy system provided by the Bank of Canada?
You have 30 seconds for a response.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Some of the research that we've done in this area suggests that financial institutions may be investing in green and transition assets at a lower level than what they would otherwise because of the lack of standardized information. So this is actually not about changing or modifying the mandate of financial institutions like pension plans, who are still going to have a fiduciary duty to the
Thank
customers
you.
that they
We'll
represent.
have to stop there, yeah.